So we spent the last few lessons talking about what exposes a photograph with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. In this lesson, we're going to start diving into how we can start controlling these settings with our cameras. So in a 30,000 foot view, there is auto mode and there is manual mode. Auto mode gives your camera complete control over your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO settings. You have no input at all. The camera is going to guess and make an estimate on how to expose the scene that you are showing it. So the major pro to auto mode is that it is super simple. You just turn it on and start clicking away. The major con though is you have no control, no input at all. So if you wanted to create a specific type of effect, well, you can't, because you can't control your aperture, you can't control your shutter speed. Another major con is your camera might start subtly increasing the ISO increment, which will start introducing noise and make your images unusable. Now, manual modes will give you complete control over your specific settings, and there's a few different modes that we're going to talk about in future lessons that really are going to help simplify your setting selection. However, the idea of manual is giving yourself control over your setting. Now, shooting in manual can be intimidating because you're in manual. You have to actually tell your camera what you want your settings to be. So you can screw up exposures pretty easily, but the freedom of control you're going to get is really what is going to separate your photography from anybody using just a smartphone out there on the market. I will say this though, there is one setting I think you should continue to use in auto, and that is white balance. You can use some of those other settings that we talked about in the white balance course, but if you just keep that on auto, you're gonna be in the ballpark and you're gonna be able to correct your white balance in post-production. It will slow you down a little bit, but to keep it simple, I would just keep it at that point right now. I will be teaching you guys a more advanced white balance setting here in the future. But before we dive into that, I wanna talk about a basic analogy of these manual modes. When I was a kid, I rode a bicycle just like many other kids. However, I couldn't just ride my bike. I needed training wheels at the beginning. The reason I put training wheels on my bike is it helped me build confidence and endurance and the balance needed to successfully ride a bicycle. And as time went on, I started to ride more and more and get more comfortable and more confident. And then one day, my dad decided to build my brother and I a bike ramp. However, he told me you can't go over the bike ramp until the training wheels come off. And I wanted to go over that bike ramp so bad, so I said, "Hey Dad, take off my training wheels." Next thing you know, I'm going up and over that ramp and having a good time. Now, if I just tried to do that at the beginning without the training wheels, I probably wouldn't have had the confidence or strength to jump over that jump. This is gonna be the same thing with these different types of manual modes. They're gonna be like training wheels for you. They're gonna limit certain things to help you build confidence and endurance with your camera. However, there's gonna come time when you are faced with a jump, or you're gonna be faced with an image that you wanna capture and you see in your mind. And those training wheels or those other modes are going to hold you back. That is when you gotta take off the training wheels, go full manual, and give yourself full control over your camera. And when you do that, sky's the limit. Now, there's gonna be 4 manual shooting modes we're gonna talk about. There's a few other modes you're gonna probably see on your dial, such as like a running man or a mountain or like a portrait. We're not gonna talk about any of those because those are actually auto modes in my opinion. And in a future lesson, I'm gonna kind of talk to you guys about what they are actually doing in those modes and how you can get to some of those settings in your camera as well. The 4 main manual modes we're gonna talk about is program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and full manual. So when your camera is in program mode and you start to show it to different exposure levels, what it's gonna do is create a balance for you. It's going to start lowering your aperture to increase the exposure. Now, if your camera detects that it can't get the exposure it wants from that specific aperture setting, then it's gonna start changing your shutter speed setting. So again, kind of creating a balance between the two. Now, you don't have control over it, but what you do have control over is ISO at this time. So if you wanted to change your ISO settings, you could. Now, the pro of this setting is this is actually pretty easy to work with. You can just turn it on and kind of fire away. It's like an auto mode, but it gives you a little bit more specific control. But the con is if you're not really paying attention and your camera starts to lower that shutter speed to a setting that's a little bit too slow, you're gonna start introducing unwanted motion blur. Now, the thing is too, it's going to change your aperture probably first. So if you wanted to have a blurry background and it's kind of bright outside, you may not get the aperture setting that you want. You don't get that full control. Now, the next shooting mode is what is called shutter speed priority, which will be represented by either a TV symbol or an S symbol on your camera. In this mode, you have full control over your shutter speed setting. After you select your shutter speed, your camera is then going to find an aperture setting to help balance out your exposure. Now, this may limit your ability to have a blurry background, or it may also limit your ability to have front to back sharpness if you want a tighter aperture setting. Now, you do get control over your ISO, which is also great. You can keep the ISO lower and you can introduce higher ISO increments when necessary, but you can put a cap on it to ensure that your image quality remains the same. Aperture priority is pretty much the same thing as shutter speed priority, except you get control over your aperture setting. From there, your camera is going to determine which shutter speed you need to help balance out the exposure. Again, you have control over white balance and ISO in this mode, which helps also maintain your image quality. And the last mode is manual mode, or an M mode. In the M mode, you have full control over your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, everything. You have to balance out the exposure triangle like we talked about before. This is the mode that I recommend you get used to shooting as soon as possible. This is when the training wheels are off and there's no limitations to what you can accomplish. If you want a specific effect, you can dial that in with your given exposure. So there are a few different ways you can have your camera release the shutter or take an image. Of course, you have your shutter release button that you press down, which is on your camera. I'm trying to point at my camera right here. When you click that, your shutter is in release. You then have different modes which allow you to either hold that button down and your camera will then take a series of images for as long as you hold down that button. Or you can also have different timing methods, such as a 2-second timer or a 10-second timer. The 2-second timer is super useful for situations where you're using a longer shutter speed and on a tripod, such as shooting landscape, because that way when you click it, it gives your camera a couple seconds to settle down from any micro vibrations caused by your hand on the camera. A 10-second timer is also useful for if you want to be in the photo yourself. You can just click that 10-second timer and get in front of your camera, get comfortable, then it will capture your image at the end of the 10 seconds. There are also these devices called intervalometers that you can use, which are an external device which allows for your camera to be on a reoccurring timer. So for example, you can set your intervalometer to have your camera take an image every 5 seconds, and you can make it do that for an hour or even longer time span. That's useful for doing time-lapse photography, which I will eventually do a course on that for you guys, as well as star trails or any other nighttime kind of sky images if you want to do those. So depending on your camera makeup though, if you're using a high-speed continuous shooting or a low-speed continuous shooting, your camera body will determine how many images per second you can take. For example, my camera, I can shoot either 20 frames per second with an electronic shutter, or if I use the mechanical shutter, I can shoot 12 frames per second. Now that is all specific to your camera, and with some of the newer mirrorless cameras, you can also set for electronic shutters like mine, which unlock different abilities with these drive mode types. A lot of the newer cameras also have built-in intervalometers. Like my camera, I can actually do all my intervalometer settings inside of my camera. And there's also a mode called bulb that you can use with your camera. In bulb mode, it allows your shutter to remain open for a given period of time. Again, you usually would need an intervalometer for that, but a lot of the newer models allow you to set bulb timers internally in your camera. So if you wanted to go past 30-second exposure, for example, you can set your camera to have a 10-minute exposure if you want in bulb mode. A lot of that is special to photography situations you may find yourself in, so we're not going to cover it in detail, but in future courses that I'm going to continue to add, I will talk about those features and how to use them when needed. The main reason I want to talk to you guys about the different drive modes is first off, so you guys can figure out, oh, I want to do a quick shutter burst, how do I do that? And also to talk about those other modes when we were talking about our manual shooting modes that I told you to ignore, such as the Running Man. The main thing that the Running Man does is an auto shooting mode, and then it changes your drive mode to a high-speed continuous. So that's why I told you guys to ignore that until this portion, because you can use a shutter priority manual mode and then set your drive mode manually to a high-speed continuous if you wanted to hold down your shutter release button to take a series of images. So make sure you guys take a look at your camera specifications so you can see how fast your camera can capture. 20 frames per second is really fast. A lot of the sports photographers out there will use cameras that that can shoot all the way up to 30 frames per second, which is almost as fast, or is pretty much faster than what a video recording would do, which is pretty cool. You can actually do like video recording at that point. But the last thing you want to look at is also your SD card type. You want to have a high quality SD card, because if you don't have a higher quality, the read-write speeds may be a little bit slow for your camera, which will cause buffering during your shooting. And at some point, your camera may exceed the buffer limit, which will stop your shooting until it catches up on the read-write speed. This is a pretty simple lesson, but it's also important for you guys to understand because these are pretty cool tools for you to use in your arsenal.